stories about water and urban places. This is Ideanthro. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Ideanthro. And welcome back to another That's Like WSUD episode, where we take a concept or an idea or a thought or something that we've come across somewhere, somehow, and relate it back to water-sensitive urban design. This episode, I don't quite currently know how to describe this. I'm just going to tell you a story of something that I very recently heard, and that'll make sense in a second. And something that I heard quite recently, but not quite as recently. And then I'm going to show you how those two things are similar and try and relate it back to WSUD. But I'll preface this by saying my thoughts on this are not fully evolved. So this is more of a, hey, look what I just noticed. Make what we will out of it sort of episode. Okay, so I just went to an AILA, that's the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects event. I was there because I was asked to film it for them. And the event was being held, I believe it was titled Conversations with Elders, and it was being held because AILA has recently released its Reconciliation Action Plan. So the event was related to that. And the event featured two speakers. One of them was Auntie Ruby Sims, who's an Aboriginal elder. And the other was Adjunct Associate Professor Phil Haywood, who used to run the Department of Planning and Landscape Architecture at QUT for about 10 years. And so the conversation here is around this Reconciliation Action Plan. And the conversation pretty early got onto the topic of process. So in these things, as the action plan was being created, and I'm going to do my best to try and paraphrase this back, and I hope I do it some degree of justice. The conversation got to the topic of process and how process in creating the action plan wasn't just important, but it's everything. So Auntie Ruby kicked this discussion off, describing that how for her, it's not about the outcome. So the Western world, or the Western elements of Australia, is very outcome focused. So we do things to get to an outcome. And Auntie Ruby was contrasting this for her experience and her culture, and again, I hope I'm doing this some degree of justice, how outcomes will happen, but process is everything. So taking the time to talk about things, taking the time to go through the process to make something happen. And this was super interesting for me, enlightening, eye-opening for me. But it reminded me of something that I'd heard in different words only about a week earlier from a very different source. At least to me, seemed like a very different source. Maybe it's not. This is where this episode gets, well, that was already interesting for me. But this is where the parallel comes in, and it gets interesting for the parallel reason. So I'm in the process of organising a debate session for the Stormwater Australia conference, which at the time that I'm recording this is about a week away. It's actually, it's 2 weeks today, the debate is. A little bit less than that by the time this video gets released. And John Madden from the Productivities Commission is going to be speaking just before the debate in that session. And he and I were talking about what he's going to talk about. And broadly speaking, it's around the topic of what does the stormwater industry need to do to get recognition and to promote stormwater, if it's relevant to be promoted, at a federal level in Australia from a governance and a policy space. And in our conversation, I don't want to preempt too much of what John's going to say, but he said to me how there are very specific processes from the Productivities Commission's point of view that stormwater would have to go through to demonstrate its value. And it struck me how that was very interesting. How in the space of about a week, I'd had, well, 3 people, but Auntie Ruby prompted it, and then Phil Haywood added to the discussion, and then John Madden completely separately, had all advocated the importance of process in, sure, there's an outcome that's going to happen, and maybe we're deliberately striving to it, or maybe we're just moving along the process to get there and see whatever the right outcome is. But the fact that these two very different groups, very different walks of life, advocated process to me struck me as very interesting. And I've been mulling over that in the probably 2 hours or so since I heard Auntie Ruby raise this. And it reminded me of something, and this is where we relate this back to WSUD, although the stormwater reference has already related it back to WSUD. But it reminded me that years ago, I used to deliver a course that was about conceivably or hopefully about helping local governments to get on top of management and maintenance of their stormwater treatment assets. And in this course, we used to go out to a local government and spend a day with them. And course is a bad word for this, actually. You'll see in a minute why that's actually a terrible description of this. So we used to go out and spend a day with the local government, and you have people from all sorts of different departments who could vaguely conceivably be relevant to this discussion there. And we used to have a discussion. And so maybe when this was conceived of, it was thought of as a, in fact, I know for a case when this was first proposed as a project, and I was working Healthy Waterways at the time. When it was first proposed as a project, it was conceived of as let's go and teach maintenance and management. But the course was never about that, because I always had a theory that if people are given the right conditions to be able to do maintenance of stormwater treatment assets, they'll figure it out for themselves. So the course was about, how do we, in the space of one day, which is ludicrous, but in the space of one day, go and spend some time with some people at local government and help them to be in a slightly better position to look after their assets. And what it turned out to be the case, what we did, and I'm very proud of this because I think it was absolutely the right choice. What we did was we just used to run through a process of discussions, of talking about it. There was no look, this is the way it should be done, jump to it. Even though I had examples of other local governments that had gone through a similar process and got to it. So conceivably, you could have rocked up and been like, this is what someone else has done, go do this, blah, 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 blah. No, every single time we repeated the process of talking and talking and talking. There'd be little bits that you'd want to throw out at certain particular times, but there was always just the process of needing to discuss it that would ultimately help people move in the right direction. And sometimes it'd be to a lesser degree, sometimes it'd be to a greater degree. I certainly don't pretend that we came in and magically fixed stuff for people. I can point to a couple of examples where those local governments, after that session, went off and did heaps of great work of their own that got them a maintenance budget and got their maintenance happening. And I can point to other examples where nothing really happened afterwards. But I feel really important that whatever progress was made, it was always due to the fact that we weren't fixated on we have to get to an outcome right here, right now. Instead, that we're going to go through a process and take the time, because the process has to happen. And if we don't get through it, we don't get through it. But the process has to happen. And so I don't know really what to make of this, but I just found it fascinating that I've had or heard two conversations from two completely different, or what appear to be completely different spaces in the past week, that have both so strongly promoted the concept of you have to go through the process, that if you want to make something happen, or if there's something that needs to be decided upon, or needs to happen, or need to, whatever it is, there's process. And you have to do things by the process. Maybe it's not always the same process. Maybe the process for Auntie Ruby and her community is one process. Maybe the process for the Productivity Commission is completely different. In fact, I don't doubt that it's completely different. But it struck me that perhaps it's a case that for any situation where we're trying to get stuff done in this world, or there's a decision to be made, or something to happen, that maybe that for whatever groups are involved, there is a right process. And that maybe the first step in whatever that is and getting that thing done has to be figuring out what the right process is. And then heading down. That sounds remarkably obvious. Simple, obvious realizations can be good, right? But maybe that's the case, and maybe that's something that we can build, or that I can build into my projects in the future as an early step, which is figure out what the right process is. Not just what the process we're going to follow. Not just the, look, it's, we're running a project and project management says this, but the case of, okay, based on the very specific nuances of this particular occasion and the people involved and whatever other nuances there are involved, what is the right process with all that context, and then build the project around that. Okay. That's musing. That's been useful for me to talk through. I have no idea if that was useful for you. Let me know.
Before you go, our best episodes come from your questions. This knowledge base, these discussions that are Ideanthro, improve with your contribution. So if there's a topic, an idea, a concept that you would like us to explore, come and ask us. You know where to find us. www.ideanthro.com/contact. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and that place you get your good podcasts from. You know where to find us. We look forward to hearing from you. We'll see you soon.